Hi, welcome to the Thinkers and Dreamers podcast. Self-improvement guided by literature, world mythology, and history. Episode 2, Fear and Worry. We all know that our attitude massively impacts the quality of our lives. It determines how we feel, it changes how we act. All of that affects what happens in our physical reality. Now, some people have a great attitude by nature, but many of us, myself included, need to learn how to improve our attitude so we can lead richer lives. For me, and many people I've talked to, our biggest problem is the way our attitude changes constantly, going through wild swings that seem to be beyond our control. We will gyrate through several radically different attitudes, even when our physical circumstances remain the same. One day, our situation makes us devastatingly sad. Then the clouds part, and we become stridently optimistic. One day we believe we have been sentenced to live in hell, and the next day we believe that life is glorious. All the while, nothing substantial has changed about our physical reality, but our attitude causes us to experience the same things in totally different ways. Many of us soar and dive like this all the time. In my experience, based on conversations with amazing people I've met all over the world, the worst causes of a dive into a bad attitude are fear and worry. Now, of course, we all know there are good reasons to be afraid and good reasons to worry. Facts about our global, local, and personal situation can force us into fear and worry and keep us there. Yet, even when the world traumatizes us, we have power over our attitude. Probably the greatest proof of that comes from Viktor Frankl's classic, A Man's Search for Meaning. Amazing book. Even when he was imprisoned in a Nazi death camp, surrounded by inhumanity and hopelessness, he could still control his attitude. Ultimately, he concluded that trauma is not caused by what happens to us. He found that trauma is what happens inside of us, in our experience of consciousness, as a response to what happens to us. That's attitude. Power over attitude gives us power over our entire experience of life. Frankl believed that his ability to maintain control over his attitude enabled him to survive. In less dire situations, such as our regular lives, attitude can end up changing our physical circumstances. A shift in attitude, if it can be maintained through hardship and setbacks, can eventually change everything. To give you an example of how an outstanding attitude can do that, let me tell you about one of the amazing women I've known. Let's call her Jane. Jane was born into a truly terrible situation. Her mother wasn't sure who her father was, and Jane never met him. Jane's mother was mentally ill, swinging into times of lucidity and then slinging out into periods of psychosis. It was impossible for Jane to predict her mother's behavior. When her mother was psychotic, she was completely neglectful, often for long periods of time. When her mother was lucid, she was weirdly and improperly attentive. How is it possible that fear and worry did not dominate Jane's childhood and ruin her psyche? How did she avoid falling into psychosis herself? Why didn't she just become a drug addict? Given her terrible situation, how could she grow up to be the powerful woman I know? There are two parts to the answer, and the second part is especially interesting to those of us who need to learn how to have a good attitude. The first part is the obvious part. She is naturally strong. Somehow, when she was just a toddler, she realized that if she didn't take care of herself, no one would. Rather than fall apart and cry out to the cosmos for relief, which is what I would have done, she figured out how to take care of herself. As she made mistakes, she learned. By the time she was 7, she was essentially capable of living on her own. That's when distant relatives finally took her in and delivered her from her horrible situation. She's an extreme example of the power of attitude. To her way of thinking, she, quote, had no choice, end quote, but to respond to her situation the way she did. But only mentally strong people think like that. She did have a choice. She could have fallen apart. She could have let fear and worry whip her into a despondent mess. But she was born with some innate resilience that not everyone has. That brings us to the second part of the answer to how could she grow up to be a powerful woman. I find this part particularly fascinating. Jane tells me that she has always been aware of some supernatural power that would protect her. Her confidence in this power gave her strength. If I had been in her situation, I would have concluded that there was a supernatural power that hated me. But somehow, she experienced it as a protector. She tells me about this supernatural power with this look in her eye and a grin on her face that lets me know she knows that this power will never fail her and never betray her. What is it? I've heard about it from many others. I've spent a lot of time trying to learn about how it works in people's lives. I've tried to conjure it in my own life, and I believe I have succeeded to some degree. It seems to me that it is always there for each of us, but our experience of it is deeply and fundamentally dependent upon our attitude. Our attitude, in turn, is deeply and fundamentally dependent upon the way we process fear and worry. Let me try to give you a perspective on how this flows together and how we can learn to control it to enrich our lives. To do that, let's look at how fear and worry play out when we have no control over it and when there is no protective power giving us strength. It's easier to understand how our attitude and this supernatural power intertwine when we look at a life without them. We'll use Kublai Khan for this. He was a great Mongol emperor in the 13th century, and he was the grandson of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan changed history by establishing the Silk Road, which linked Europe and China. Historians know a lot about his grandson, Kublai Khan, and they have psychoanalyzed Kublai Khan to the extreme, which makes him a useful example for our purposes. Here's a crucially important fact about him. From birth, everyone around Kublai Khan taught him that his life as an individual didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was his legacy as an emperor. To establish his legacy, he would need glorious conquest. The Mongols believed that they were destined to rule over a vast territory, so conquest was the greatest achievement a Mongol emperor could attain. Kublai Khan's entire purpose in life was drilled into him from birth. He was going to make conquests so the Mongols could fulfill their destiny. He's a perfect example of Carl Jung's observation that a culture's collective unconsciousness deeply affects individuals within that culture. Kublai Khan learned to see himself as a manifestation of the Mongols' collective belief about who they were supposed to be. When Genghis Khan died from battle injuries, Kublai Khan rose to power. At first, he was enormously successful. By 1271, he had established the Yuan dynasty, which controlled a vast territory across China and along the Silk Road. He was a ruthless ruler, of course, but aspects of his rule were quite enlightened for his time. Across his empire, he tolerated all religions. He built Xanadu, a royal capital with lush gardens and woods, and a palace so spectacular it influenced Chinese and Mongolian architecture for centuries. He welcomed intellectual curiosity, and Xanadu attracted scholarly talent from all over the world, including Europeans like the explorer Marco Polo. Despite all of this, Kublai Khan lived in the grip of fear and worry. Even after all this territory was under his control, which by any rational measure would mean that the Mongols had fulfilled their destiny and that he was a great emperor, Kublai Khan was terrified that if he stopped conquering new lands, his legacy would be ruined. Even worse than that, he was terrified that he might somehow lose it all. For various reasons, his fears and worries came to focus on the Japanese. As an island nation, Japan had great power at sea. Kublai Khan was afraid that they would attack his shipping. He worried that they would seize his conquered territories. He feared that they would serve as a home base for his many enemies. The Japanese came to represent the gravest possible threat to all that he was supposed to be. Therefore, he wanted to conquer them. His advisors were against it. They warned him that the empire couldn't afford to attack Japan. They told him that his chances of victory were slim because the Mongols were not a seafaring people and the Japanese were the best seafaring people in the world. They strongly recommended that resources would be better spent dealing with the more pressing problems of keeping the brand new Yuan Empire under control. But Kublai Khan's fear and worry carried the day. His legacy was all that mattered, and so he continued to conquer. He built a massive armada and sent it to attack Kyushu, Japan's southernmost island. Before it even got there, his fleet suffered a stroke of remarkably bad luck when a sudden typhoon destroyed it. His advisors suggested that he learn from this disaster. They wondered if it was a sign from the gods. They encouraged him to abandon the effort and to focus on his empire. Again, Kublai Khan overruled them. His worry and fear dominated his entire thought process. He remained obsessed with his legacy, and therefore, he irrationally remained obsessed with Japan. For his second attack, he sent two fleets, and they approached Kyushu from two different directions. Once again, a typhoon wiped out most of his ships. The ones that remained were overwhelmed by Japanese forces, and his sailors were killed or enslaved. This was a complete disaster for Kublai Khan. Rebel kingdoms throughout his empire gained the courage to challenge him. Elites within his own court lost confidence in him. Corruption turned the people against him. As his advisors had warned him, the resources he wasted on Japan left him vulnerable at home. His empire began to crumble. His conquests came undone. Kublai Khan retreated into Xanadu and decayed into a lazy hedonist. For our purposes, the main point is that his fear and worry drove him directly into the worst possible fate for him. His fear and worry ended up destroying his legacy. Fear and worry about the fate he most wanted to avoid caused exactly that fate to manifest. No supernatural power protected him or even guided him. And here's where we get our first clues as to how we might learn to access Jane's supernatural power. Kublai Khan's motivation and truth came directly from the beliefs pounded into him as a kid. Jane's source of truth, on the other hand, was clear-eyed cognition regarding the real world. Kublai Khan did not see himself as a person. He saw himself as the embodiment of a legacy, or as the embodiment of the Mongol people. Jane was whole unto herself, even as a toddler. Kublai Khan did nothing but judge. He judged himself, he judged what others thought of him, he judged his legacy. As a person, he wasn't even in the equation. He had no self-worth. Jane did not judge her circumstances. She did not distract herself with wishes. She didn't even compare herself or her mother to social norms, which is really quite remarkable. She accessed an innate sense of self-worth, which is even more remarkable. Self-worth. That's the key to this whole search for the supernatural power. Self-worth has a massive impact on our attitude. Viktor Frankl had a strong sense of self-worth and survived. Jane had a strong sense of self-worth and triumphed in life. Kublai Khan had a completely different sense of self and no sense of self-worth like Jane's at all. If we are truly honest, we will understand that a poor attitude and a poor sense of self-worth are deeply related. A person with a strong sense of self-worth does not judge what's going on relative to some ideal about what should be going on. People with a strong sense of self-worth have a different way of approaching life. So, let's shift to a positive example now. Let me give you a glimpse of how a good attitude and a strong sense of self-worth play out. For that, we'll use the protagonist in Sarah A. Parker's wonderful fantasy, When the Moon Hatched. Our hero is Reeve, and she's an assassin. At a young age, she becomes a rebel, confronting the evil tyrants who vie for power in her world. But when her luck runs out, she finds herself imprisoned in a dungeon. Her captors drove an iron spike into her shoulder blade, which took away her magic. They shackled her hands and her feet. Attitude and self-worth are sorely tested in hardship. And if we want to find that supernatural connection, these are the tests that matter most. Reeve doesn't worry about her situation. She doesn't compare it to the way things should be. She knows that she is going to be executed. She hopes that she is drawn and quartered because that would be quick. She hopes that she is not fed to a dragon because being roasted and then eaten would be horrible. When they come for her, they take her to the middle of an arena, Roman style. Roaring crowds surround her, cheering for the execution of a dangerous renegade. They tie her to a post. She's bummed because that means she's going to be fed to a dragon. But still, she doesn't worry. She doesn't chafe against her situation, knowing that that's pointless. She's doomed, but she does not quake with fear. She watches the sky, and soon enough, the dragon appears. It is unbelievably huge. It lands on the rim of the Colosseum and terrifies the audience. Then it glides to land in the arena before her. But it doesn't eat her right away. It examines her for some time. Reeve doesn't tremble with worry, though she does wish that the beast would stop looking at her and get it over with. Then the dragon makes a decision and lunges. It takes her into its mouth, ripping the post from the ground. With magnificent beats of its huge wings, it flies away. The dragon holds Reeve alive in its mouth. She can feel the heat of the organ that produces its breath of fire. Her feet slip on the dragon's teeth. She realizes that the dragon is going to feed her to its young, but even still, she doesn't worry about it or chafe at it. She doesn't fear what people might think of her legacy either. She doesn't even worry about the fact that she is doomed. She just witnesses her actual situation as it unfolds. Of course, I'm not going to tell you what the dragon does with her. That's not the point. The point is that Reeve's attitude keeps her alert to what is actually happening moment to moment. Emotions don't distract her, neither do judgments. This enables her to react to the dragon without fear, realizing that she's still alive while she's in its mouth, and even avoiding the dragon's teeth and its fire-breathing organ while it flies. She remains wholly focused on her experience in real time, living in the moment without distraction or abstraction. Fear and worry eliminate that connection to the present. A foundational belief in her own self-worth enables Reeve to keep her wits about her even in this extreme situation. Fear and worry, which arise from judgment, eliminate that sense of self-worth. The opposite of fear is presence. The opposite of worry is self-worth. Presence and self-worth create a better attitude. That is what opens us up to the supernatural force that Jane tells us about. It's a dance between us and the supernatural. As we drop our judgments, as we learn to stop comparing what is to what we think should be, we become more present in our actual situation. Fear subsides to its proper level, and we spend little time indulging it. Worry subsides to its proper level, and we become sure of our own self-worth. This process can take years. In my case, it took decades. But as we make these things happen in our own consciousness, the supernatural powers that Jane experienced begin to dance with us. This podcast will be all about that dance. What I've described here is a universal challenge faced by almost everyone. I've come to believe that we were all born dancing with the supernatural as naturally as we dance with those we love. I believe that we are all born with a powerful sense of self-worth. Most of us lose it when we are children. It's taken from us, as it was taken from Kublai Khan. Much of the trauma we endure throughout life arises from that theft. Ultimately, our quest for self-actualization is our quest to get it back. And we can. I'll tell you everything I know about how to do that. Next episode, we'll discuss one of the major reasons self-worth eludes us. We don't know who our true self is. There are several voices in our minds, several lives we want, several people we could be. Which one is our true self? How do we find out? I'll give you the best clues I have next time. Thank you for listening to Thinkers and Dreamers, a podcast about self-improvement that's guided by literature, world mythology, and history. My name is Tom Bast. Visit me at tombast.com.